I don't normally speak from prepared remarks, but this is a somewhat controversial topic, and so I wanted to try to be a bit more precise in my language than I normally am. So I'm going to mostly read from a prepared text. So when the IPCC released its 1.5 degree report this past October, the results seemed very, very clear. The world needs to move away from fossil fuels, end tropical deforestation, electrify transportation, adopt low-carbon lifestyles, and more at scale and with urgent speed, or we would face certain devastating consequences from climate change. What received less attention was an additional dimension to the conversation. The report, more than any of its predecessors, made it very clear that any scientifically realistic pathway to a future in which temperature rise is limited to 1.5 degrees C must require the use of so-called negative emissions approaches and technologies. In other words, we see that scientists now are asserting that the only way ultimately to limit temperature rise to the agreed-on Paris Agreement target is to use a range of methods and technologies, all of which are untested at scale, to remove carbon dioxide from Earth's atmosphere. While we do not necessarily agree with this assertion, it is fair to say that it represents a scientific consensus in a growing number of influential forums. Welcome. Collectively, these negative emissions technologies, together with other potential technologies that would attempt to reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth, are referred to as climate engineering. And I wish to say that we wish at GreenFaith that we did not need to write and speak about these technologies and these issues. We would much rather continue working with many of you who are here today and others who will read the report that we release, to continue to speak out, to educate, to mobilize, to organize, to divest, to invest, and to advocate for the kinds of responses to climate change that we know can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and accelerate clean energy development. However, we have come to believe that ignoring climate engineering, ignoring this part of the policy conversation, is no longer an option. We are far enough behind in our collective response to climate change that, like it or not, we must now acknowledge that some form of climate engineering is integrated into the world's most sophisticated scientific projections about how we might avoid a future ravaged by an out-of-control climate. Other forms of climate engineering, while still at highly preliminary stages of development, are receiving increasing attention as emissions levels stubbornly fail to fall at the necessary rate. For us, broaching this topic of climate engineering evokes intense, painful emotions. It evokes for us anger at the ineffectiveness of our political systems to address a problem which has been recognized for decades. It evokes fears of a future in which untested technologies are unleashed on an unexpected world by global elites who decide where to set the global thermostat. It evokes anxiety that even by simply discussing this topic, by offering or holding out the prospect of a technological fix, we will contribute to a lessening of intensity that governments and businesses must feel to reduce their emissions and to work with vulnerable communities on needed adaptation. It evokes despair at a situation which in 2015 at COP21 seemed finally to be heading in the right direction, only to slip back out of control. It evokes a stunned realization that climate engineering schemes had been hiding in plain sight within some scientists' projections even before the Paris Agreement. And finally, it evokes a profound discomfort that we are considering engaging in a new form of playing God on a level and in a way that will affect every person on the planet. We have wrestled for many months with these emotions and with the information that scientists are sharing about what is required to achieve a 1.5-degree future. In response, and because discussion of this topic is growing in public and among leaders in science, government, industries, and some leading climate NGOs, we have decided that the time has come for religious groups to play our role by sharing moral and religious responses to climate engineering. This report that we are sharing with you today, and that is now online, is our first effort to do that. As we engaged with theologians and ethicists and scholars of religion, or as Dr. Klingerman did, we found that most knew little to nothing about this topic. And so we provided some introductory education on the issue. Because of this, we wish to emphasize that the essays and the theological reflections that we are offering represent a first effort to examine this topic from a diversity of moral and religious perspectives. And we are very grateful for the reflections of the authors in this report, as we are grateful for Dr. Klingerman's editorial guidance. And we should also mention the insights of Cynthia Sharp from the Carnegie Climate Change Geoengineering Governance Initiative, C2G2. Their contributions have made this complex topic more accessible to us, and we hope to a religious audience. We want to say that we welcome your feedback to this report, and we look forward to responding to further developments within the climate engineering conversation, with perspectives informed by our collective faiths. The world's religious traditions affirm care for the most vulnerable and respect for the profound interconnectedness of our global environment. Our advocacy about this topic at GreenFaith will be guided by these commitments and by our belief that the climate crisis requires a moral transformation in the personal, cultural, economic, and political dimensions of human society. And in the meantime, as this discussion develops, we will continue to press hard for equitable and just climate action. Above all, reduction in emissions and distributed renewable energy development at the fastest possible rate to minimize or even avoid the use of climate geoengineering. One final thought. Engaging this subject has forced us to reflect critically on the narrative that we have embraced in response to the climate crisis. In other words, we would like to suggest that by engaging the topic of climate engineering, we are engaging in two parallel and interconnected conversations. First, we are talking explicitly about climate engineering and our moral and ethical and religious responses to that. But secondly, we believe that this topic forces us to engage the topic of the narratives with which we choose to engage this subject. Our past narrative might be said to have been modeled, to use a biblical metaphor, on the David and Goliath story. In this narrative, in the face of an overwhelmingly powerful adversary, a small, resourceful, courageous, righteous group of activists points out the dangerous threats that we face, awakens the conscience of the wider community, and pushes and motivates those in power to do what is so clearly right, thereby helping protect the future of life itself. The villains in this story that we have embraced have been, largely, though not exclusively, the fossil fuel industry and the governments which they have so easily corrupted, while heroes have included NGOs, activists, scientists, clean energy leaders, enlightened politicians, faith communities, and other members of the wider climate movement. In addition to its satisfaction on the important level of moral emotion, we still find resonance in this narrative, We still believe that the corrupting influence of incumbent extractive industries and the captivity of governments globally represent a grave threat to the future of the planet. At the same time, we find the need increasingly to search for public narratives that can reckon with the undeniable reality that our current systems have so far terribly failed to deliver in needed ways, and that we now inescapably face climate impacts at a tragic and unjust level, and that we must be prepared in the face of this to find ways to avoid despair, to redouble our efforts, to respond to disasters and those victimized by the climate crisis with compassion and with justice, and to engage a far wider number of people more deeply, passionately, and intelligently than ever before. We are committed to this, and we look forward to collaborating with many of you to develop these new narratives which we believe to be vital in response to our actual current context. In the aftermath of that introduction, I'd now like to